Jonas had always loved the easy life. Fast money, and endless nights at the club. For years, he made a living as a small-time online scammer, preying on the naive and the desperate. He knew all the tricks, the smooth lines, the perfect lies. He was careful, calculated, and always covered his tracks. But he was tired of being small time. No matter how much he made, it never lasted. He would score a few hundred naira from his latest victim, and within a week, he would be back to square one, broke, hungover, and desperate for the next big hit. One night, as he sat in his dingy apartment, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey, while the flickering light bulb above cast unsettling shadows on the cracked walls, he began to think. He was tired of hustling for scraps. He wanted the kind of money that wouldn't run out, the kind that would keep him in luxury with no need to check his bank balance. He wanted to be a king, not a petty thief. He began searching for opportunities online until he stumbled across a website that purchased African village oracles for a whopping sum of $5 million. His eyes widened as he conducted more research and realized the information was solid. People had been previously paid. He couldn't believe his luck. Their village shrine was right next to his family house, and he knew exactly where their oracle was kept and how he could get it. Jonas wasted no time. He visited high-end car dealerships, inquiring about the prices of Ferraris and Lamborghinis, confident that soon he would be swimming in wealth. In his mind, he had already stolen and sold the oracle, living the extravagant lifestyle he had always dreamed of. He packed his bags, including his old worn-out backpack that had seen better days, and embarked on a journey back to his village. Nagu, an ancient place known for its mystical powers and powerful oracle. Upon arrival, his parents were surprised to see him, as they hadn't seen nor heard from him in many years. They welcomed him warmly, their faces worn with age but brightened by his unexpected presence, thankful that their son was finally back, unaware of the sinister plan he harbored. That night, as his family slept, Jonas made his move. Sneaking out under the cover of darkness, he made his way to the shrine. The air was thick with an eerie silence, the kind that sent shivers down his spine. He hesitated for a moment, but greed pushed him forward. With careful steps, he entered the sacred chamber, the moonlight casting long, jagged shadows through the small windows, and laid his hands on the oracle. The moment he lifted it, a gust of wind howled through the shrine, rattling the wooden carvings that lined the walls, and a deep, guttural voice echoed in the darkness. "You dare desecrate this place." The voice rumbled, shaking Jonas to his core. Terror gripped him, but he clenched his teeth and ran. He sprinted back to his parents' house, stuffing the oracle into his bag. He had done it. He had stolen the very thing that made his village sacred. Now, all he had to do was sell it. The very next morning, Jonas left the village and was on his way back to the city without telling anyone. He couldn't believe he had done it. But as he journeyed back, strange things began to happen. The vehicle he boarded broke down several times along the way, each time forcing the driver to check under the hood in frustration. But the moment Jonas stepped out, the car roared back to life. Puzzled, the driver motioned for him to get back in. But the moment his foot touched the floor of the bus, the engine sputtered and died again. "One of the passengers," An elderly woman with piercing eyes and a collection of amulets hanging around her neck pointed at him. "Something follows you, young man. What have you done?" Jonas forced a nervous chuckle. "What are you talking about, Mama? It's just a coincidence," the passengers murmured among themselves. To confirm their suspicions, they all re-entered the bus while keeping Jonas outside. The vehicle remained on, but the moment he tried to step in, it shut off instantly. The driver wiped sweat from his forehead. "Olga, I no fit carry you again. Here is your money. Find another way." Jonas gritted his teeth and tried several other cars, but the same thing kept happening. No driver would take him after witnessing the eerie pattern. Finally, he spotted a horse-drawn carriage and, out of desperation, climbed inside. The instant he settled into the seat, the horses neighed violently, their eyes rolling back. Then, without warning, they collapsed, dead. A cold chill ran down Jonas's spine. The other travelers gasped, whispering prayers under their breath. It was now clear the oracle was rejecting him. His greed wouldn't let him turn back. If he took the oracle back to the shrine, all his dreams of wealth would vanish. No, he had come too far. If he had to walk back to the city, so be it. 3 days on foot was a small price to pay for the millions that awaited him. And so, with the oracle strapped tightly to his back, Jonas began his long, arduous journey. But with each step, the weight of his crime grew heavier, and the whispers of unseen forces began to follow him. By nightfall, the road was eerily silent, save for the sound of his footsteps and the occasional rustle of the trees. He felt eyes watching him from the darkness, but each time he turned around, there was nothing. His breathing grew heavy. A deep voice whispered from behind him, "Jonas." He spun around, heart pounding. No one was there. He swallowed hard and kept walking. "Jonas," the voice called again, closer this time. He broke into a run, sweat pouring down his face. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but no matter how fast he ran, the voice followed, growing louder, angrier. Then, suddenly, he tripped. He hit the ground hard, the bag containing the oracle spilling open. In the dim moonlight, he saw a shadow standing over him, a towering figure, its face hidden in darkness. "Return what you have taken," the figure commanded in a voice that was not of this world. Jonas scrambled to his feet, grabbed the bag, and ran with all his might. He didn't stop until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Exhausted, he collapsed by the roadside, gasping for breath. His body was battered, his feet swollen and blistered, but he was still alive. He had survived the night. He convinced himself it was all in his head. Maybe he was hallucinating from exhaustion. He needed to get to the city. He needed to sell the oracle. But the city was still days away, and the horrors were far from over. As he continued his journey, he noticed something strange. His shadow was no longer his own. It moved when he did not, stretching unnaturally long against the ground. Jonas kept walking, his legs heavy and his heart pounding. He didn't notice the changes happening to his body. With every step, he was growing taller. By the time he realized something was wrong, he was already 20 feet tall. His clothes were tearing at the seams, the fabric fluttering like torn flags in the breeze. His arms and legs looked strange and stretched, and his shadow didn't match his movements anymore. He looked like a monster, but his greed kept him going. The road was long and lonely, stretching endlessly under a pale moon that hung like a silent witness. At night, strange creatures appeared, their forms flickering like shadows caught between worlds. Some looked like animals with glowing eyes, others were shadows with no faces, drifting eerily along the roadside. They surrounded him, hitting him with sticks and whips carved from twisted branches, shouting, "Return what you stole." But Jonas didn't listen. He covered his head and kept walking, even though the pain was unbearable. He told himself, "Once I sell the oracle, all this will stop. I'll be rich and happy." The next day, he was even taller, almost 30 up now. His body was changing in ways he couldn't understand. His skin was turning gray, cracked like dried clay. His fingers were longer and bony, and his face looked twisted, as though molded by some cruel hand. People who saw him from a distance screamed and ran away, clutching their children and calling for help. No one dared to come near him. Jonas was scared, but he couldn't stop. He kept telling himself, "Just a little further. The city is close. I'll be rich soon." But deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. The oracle in his bag felt heavier with every step, as if it was alive and angry. That night, the creatures came again. This time, they were louder and more aggressive, their eyes burning like embers in the dark. They pulled his hair, scratched his face, and whispered in his ears, "You will never escape. Return it or suffer forever." Jonas screamed and swung his arms, trying to fight them off, but they were too many. He ran as fast as he could, his giant feet shaking the ground, leaving deep imprints in the dirt. By morning, he was too tired to move. He sat by the roadside, his body now over 40th tall. He looked at his reflection in a nearby river and gasped. He didn't recognize himself anymore. His eyes were sunken, his mouth was twisted into a grimace, and his skin was like cracked stone. He looked like a monster from a nightmare. Still, he refused to give up. He stood up, grabbed the bag with the oracle, and kept walking. But now the road seemed endless. No matter how far he walked, the city never got closer. It was as if the road was stretching longer and longer just to torture him. Days turned into nights, and nights turned into days. Jonas grew taller and more monstrous with each step, his clothes hanging in tatters from his warped frame. The creatures never left him alone. They followed him everywhere, screaming, "Return it! Return it!" But Jonas's greed was stronger than his fear. He kept telling himself, "I've come too far to turn back now." Finally, after what felt like weeks, he saw the city in the distance. His heart leapt with hope. "I'm almost there," he thought. But as he got closer, he realized something terrible. He looked hideous. His body was massive, his skin gray and cracked, his face twisted and monstrous. He knew he would scare everyone who saw him. People would run, scream, or worse. He had to think of a plan. Jonas decided to wait until nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, there would be fewer people around, and most would be asleep. He hid in a nearby forest, crouching behind trees that barely covered his enormous frame, the branches snapping under his weight. As the sun set and the city grew quiet, he slowly made his way toward his house, careful not to make too much noise. But his size made it impossible to move unnoticed. Every step shook the ground, and his shadow loomed large under the moonlight, stretching across entire streets. As he crept through the streets, he suddenly came across a group of policemen on patrol. They froze when they saw him, their flashlights illuminating his monstrous form. One of them screamed, "One of them screamed, 'What is that?' Another shouted, 'It's an alien! Shoot it!' Before Jonas could explain, the policeman opened fire. Bullets bounced off his hardened skin, but the noise and chaos terrified him. He turned and ran, his giant legs carrying him far in just a few strides. In moments, he was already at his house. But when he tried to enter, he realized it was too small for him now. He couldn't fit through the door, and even if he could, his massive frame would be impossible to hide. Anyone could see him from miles away. The police quickly traced his footsteps, giant imprints in the ground, and surrounded his house. They called for backup, and soon the area was swarming with officers, their guns trained on him. Jonas knew there was no escape. He raised his hands in surrender, his voice trembling as he shouted, "Wait, I'm not a monster. I'm Jonas. I stole the oracle from my village, and this is my punishment." The police were stunned, but didn't lower their weapons. One of them, a senior officer, stepped forward and demanded, "Where is the oracle now?" Jonas pointed to the bag still strapped to his back. "It's here. I was trying to sell it, but it cursed me. Please take it back to my village. I'll do anything to make this right." The police cautiously approached and retrieved the oracle. As soon as it was out of Jonas's hands, his body began to shrink. His monstrous form faded, and he returned to his normal size, though his face was still scarred and his eyes haunted. The policeman stared in disbelief but quickly handcuffed him. Jonas was arrested and taken into custody. The oracle was safely returned to his village, where it was placed back in the shrine. The elders performed rituals to cleanse it of the desecration, and peace was restored. As for Jonas, he was banished from the village for life. He was warned never to return, or the curse would come back even stronger. With nowhere else to go, Jonas wandered the outskirts of society, a broken man. He spent the rest of his days in regret, telling his story to anyone who would listen as a warning against greed and disrespect for the sacred. The oracle remained in its place, a powerful reminder of the consequences of stealing what was never meant to be taken. And Jonas, once a small-time scammer with dreams of wealth, became a cautionary tale, forever haunted by the curse he brought upon himself. The story of Jonas teaches us a powerful lesson. Greed can blind us to the consequences of our actions, and disrespecting what is sacred can lead to unimaginable suffering. No amount of wealth is worth losing oneself or living a life of regret. It's always better to choose the path of integrity and respect. Thank you for watching my channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out more fascinating videos right here. See you in the next one. Dad, I'm gay, and I have a boyfriend. I can't marry a girl. I don't like girls, he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The room became so quiet that Idris could hear his own heartbeat echoing against the walls. The scent of his mother's cooking still lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of his father's favorite aftershave. His father's face changed. At first he looked confused, his brow furrowing deeply, and then his expression turned angry, his jaw tightening. "What are you saying, Idris?" his father asked loudly, his voice bouncing off the living room walls. "What nonsense is this?" "It's not nonsense, is this? It's not nonsense, Baba," Idris said, his voice trembling, his fingers gripping the edge of his phone tightly. This is the truth. I've been hiding it because I was scared of how you would feel, but this is who I am. I can't pretend anymore." Idris was a young boy living in a small, busy town in Nigeria where the streets were always filled with vendors selling fresh fruits and roasted peanuts, and children running barefoot through dusty alleys. He was just 17 years old, but he already felt the heavy weight of his parents' dreams on his small shoulders. His father, Mr. Dyke, and his mother, Mrs. Lamy, worked very hard every day, waking up before the sun rose and coming home long after it had set. They didn't have much, but they hoped that Idris would grow up to become successful and make their lives better. "Idris, you're so smart," his mother would say, looking at him with hope in her eyes as she stirred a pot of soup over their small charcoal stove. "One day you will be better than all those kids we see on social media." Idris always nodded when they talked about his bright future, but deep inside, he wasn't sure if he wanted the same things they did. Sometimes he wished they would ask him what he wanted, but they never did. They only spoke of his future as though it were already written. One day, Mr. Dyke and Mrs. Lamy made a big decision. They sold some of their belongings, things they cared about, like Mr. Dyke's old radio and his mother's woven baskets, to send Idris to a famous boarding school. They believed the school would give him the best chance to succeed, and in their small, dimly lit living room, they handed him a new smartphone. "We're doing this for you, Idris," his father said as he placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "You have to work hard and make us proud. No excuses." Idris nodded again. "Yes, Baba," he said quietly, but his heart felt heavy, as though he were carrying a burden far too big for his age. When he arrived at the school, Idris felt very small and out of place. The other boys wore fancy clothes and walked like they were kings, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors of the dormitory. They spoke loudly and laughed freely, while Idris stood in the corner, unsure of what to do, his uniform slightly too big for his small frame. One day, a boy from the school smiled at him. "Hey, new boy, what's your name?" "Idris," he said shyly, his voice barely audible over the chatter of the dining hall. "Stick with us, Idris," the boy said, flashing a grin. "We'll show you how to have fun." For the first time in weeks, Idris felt like someone cared. He started following the group of boys around, laughing at their jokes and doing whatever they told him to do, even when it made his stomach twist uncomfortably. A few weeks later, one of the boys said, "We're going to a movie concert tonight. You should come." Idris didn't know what a movie concert was, but it sounded like fun. He smiled and said, "Okay," feeling excited to go out with his new friends. When they arrived, Idris immediately felt something was off. The place was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne, and strange music played softly in the background. Men were standing in small groups, some of them holding hands or standing so close their faces nearly touched. Idris noticed one man leaning in to kiss another, his hand resting lightly on the other's waist. Idris's confusion grew when one of the boys he came with put an arm around another man and laughed softly, their faces inches apart. Another boy from the group sat on a man's lap, playing with his shirt collar while whispering something that made the man smile. The air felt heavy, and Idris's stomach churned. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but it felt strange and deeply uncomfortable to him. He didn't like the way the men were looking at each other, or how freely they touched. "I need to leave," Idris whispered to himself, his chest tightening with fear and confusion. Without saying a word to anyone, He turned and ran out of the building, his heart pounding hard as he put as much distance as possible between himself and the place. When Idris went home for the holidays, he wanted to tell his parents about what had happened. But every time he tried to talk, his father would say, "Idris, excuses won't get you anywhere. You just have to try harder." His mother added, "We've given up so much for you, Idris. Don't waste this chance." Idris felt like no one wanted to hear how he really felt, so he stopped talking about his feelings and started spending more time with the boys at school, even though he knew they weren't good for him. By the time Idris turned 26, he was not the same happy boy he used to be. On the outside, he smiled and acted like everything was okay, but inside, he felt sad, lonely, and scared. He was hiding a big secret, and it made him feel like he was carrying a heavy load every day. One quiet evening after dinner, Idris sat with his parents in the living room. The TV was on, but no one was watching it. The smell of burning kerosene from their lantern filled the room. Idris sat quietly, looking at his phone, his fingers tapping anxiously against the screen, while his father, Mr. Dyke, put down his newspaper and looked at him. "Idris," his father said, breaking the silence. The room was dimly lit, the old ceiling fan whirring softly above them. "Why don't you ever talk about girls? You're old enough now. Are you seeing anyone?" Idris's heart started beating very fast. He had always known this day would come, but he wasn't ready for it. He swallowed hard and looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the loose thread on his sleeve. "Baba," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." His father raised an eyebrow, shifting slightly in his worn-out armchair. "What is it?" he asked. Idris took a deep breath. His hands were shaking, his palms slick with sweat. "I don't like girls," he said slowly. I'm gay." The room was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall and the faint sound of distant traffic from outside. Idris stood in front of his parents, his face filled with frustration and sadness. His father, Mr. Dyke, paced back and forth while his mother, Mrs. Lammy, sat on the couch, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, her shoulders trembling slightly. "Idris," his father began, his voice sharp and disappointed, "this is not how we raised you. How could you turn out like this? A man is supposed to marry a woman and build a family. This is unacceptable." Idris clenched his fist and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Baba, stop saying this is not how you raised me. Do you even remember how you pushed me into this?" Mr. Dyke stopped pacing and stared at his son. "What are you talking about? How did we push you into this?" Idris pointed at his father, his voice rising. "Do you remember when I started hanging out with that peer group in school? The ones who were always talking about being free to be yourself? You encouraged me to join them. You said they were good kids, that I could learn discipline and focus from them. Do you remember that?" His mother looked up, confused, her lips slightly parted. "Idris, are you saying your friends made you like this?" "Yes, Mama," Idris said, his tone sharp but pained. "But it wasn't just them. It was you and Baba who told me to be like them. You always said, 'Idris, look at how respectful they are. Look at how they dress. Why can't you be like them?' You wanted me to copy them so much that I started spending all my time with them. And that's when I realized who I am." Mr. Dyke's face tightened, his voice defensive. "We didn't tell you to become this. We wanted you to learn good behavior, not. Not what, Baba? Idris interrupted, his eyes blazing. Not to find out who I really am, not to be honest with myself. You encouraged me to spend time with them, and when I started feeling different, I tried to talk to you, but you shut me down. Every time I came to you, you brushed me off. Don't talk nonsense, Idris, you'd say. Just focus on your studies. Now you're blaming me. Now you're blaming me. Now you're calling me a disappointment? How is that fair? His mother's hands shook as she held her tissue. Idris, we didn't know. We thought we were helping you. We didn't mean for this to happen. Well, it did, Idris said, his voice firm but calmer. And I don't regret it. I love who I am. I'm not ashamed anymore. And I won't let you make me feel like I'm broken. Mr. Dyke slammed his hand on the table, making the old wooden frame shake slightly. You don't regret it, Idris. How can you stand there and say that? Don't you know what this means for our family? People will talk. They'll shame us. Idris laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Oh, so this is about what people will say, not about me, your son, and how I feel. You care more about strangers than about my happiness. Don't twist my words. Idris, his father snapped, his hands tightening into fists. We're worried about you. We want the best for you. This is not the best. Idris took a step closer, his voice softer but no less determined. Baba, you don't know what's best for me. You think marrying a girl is the answer. Let me tell you something. Girls aren't loyal. I've seen it. I've watched friends get hurt by women who lied, cheated, and left them broken. I've seen marriages fall apart because people were forced into roles they didn't want. That's not the life I want. His mother shook her head, tears streaming down her face, her breath hitching slightly. But Idris, not all girls are like that. You can find a good woman, someone who will love you. I found love, Mama, Idris said, his voice steady, unwavering. But it's not in the way you imagined. And that's okay. I'm happy with who I am. For the first time in my life, I'm not pretending to be someone else. Isn't that what you've always wanted for me? To be happy? Mr. Dyke looked away, his hands on his hips, his face conflicted, his jaw working as if he were trying to form words but couldn't find the right ones. Idris stepped back, his voice growing quieter, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I just want you to see me for who I am, not for who you want me to be. I tried to be the perfect son, but it wasn't enough. Now I'm being myself, and it's still not enough. What do you want from me? The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy with anger. It was filled with thought. His parents exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. Idris took one last deep breath and said, I love you both. I always have. But I can't keep fighting for your approval. I've learned to love myself, and that's what matters most. With that, Idris walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving his parents to sit in the silence of their thoughts. This story teaches us an important lesson. True happiness comes from embracing who we are, not from living up to the expectations of others. Idris's journey reminds us that self-acceptance is key, and that love and understanding should come before judgment. We should support those around us and listen to them rather than forcing them into roles that don't fit. Thank you for watching my channel. Stay tuned for more powerful and thought thought-provoking stories, don't forget to check out other exciting videos in the channel. As she returned home that evening, her stepmother called her all sorts of degrading names, saying that her evil hair was the root cause of all the terrible things that had been happening. She called her dreadlocks evil snakes hanging on her head, saying that if she fails to cut her hair, evil will continue to be unleashed. Once upon a time, in the heart of a very small village, surrounded by vast green fields and dense forests, lived a girl named Zara. Zara was unlike any other girl in the village. Her dreadlocks set her apart from her peers, who made fun of her because of her hair. They would tug at her hair while she walked on the street, and some even went as far as believing that she was possessed. The dusty streets of the village often echoed with their jeers, as Zara tried to ignore them. Zara's mother spared no opportunity to tell her how special she was, but this was so hard for her to believe, as every other person in the village detested her because of her hair. One day, Zara was fetching some water from the village stream when a boy named Ayo arrived at the stream with his friends. Ayo was the son of a very wealthy man in the village. He was well known and respected, often seen riding on a majestic white horse that was the pride of his family. He approached Zara and requested that she give him some water from her clay pot. His friends laughed as they waited to see Zara's reaction. Without saying any word, Zara dipped a small calabash into her clay pot and offered it to Ayo, who was shocked at her calm demeanor. As Ayo drank from the calabash, he found himself staring at Zara's dreadlocks, and his friends wondered what had come over him. He handed the calabash back to her, as he thanked her for being so kind. All his friends opened their mouths in shock, as this was so unusual of Ayo, who was always arrogant and rude. They laughed at him as they teased him for drinking from a cursed girl's water pot, but Ayo paid no mind to them, as he could not shake off the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. As the days passed, Zara's encounter with Ayo became the subject of gossip in the village, especially as Ayo became terribly ill. Many believed that Ayo had been bewitched by the girl with the strange hair, while others speculated that the curse which followed Zara had transferred into Ayo, making him sick. His rich father did everything within his power to restore his son's health, but as the days went by, Ayo's sickness grew worse. Zara felt so terrible, as everyone believed that she was the cause of his sickness. The accusing eyes pierced through her skin as she walked the streets of the village, and Zara, in that moment, knew that she had to do something about all that was happening. As she returned home that evening, her stepmother called her all sorts of degrading names, saying that her evil hair was the root cause of all the terrible things that had been happening. She called her dreadlocks evil snakes hanging on her head, saying that if she fails to cut her hair, evil will continue to be unleashed. Zara felt so terrible to hear this as she retreated into her hut and began to cry. She took a sharp blade and was about to cut her hair when her mother entered the hut and stopped her. Zara wept uncontrollably as she asked her mother if she was cursed, and her mother told her that her hair was a blessing and that she should not listen to all that the people were saying because she was perfect with her dreadlocks. Night came and Zara could not sleep. She was so worried about the rich man's son, Ayo, as she wondered if she had a hand in his sickness. Zara began to whistle her favorite song, hoping to fall asleep, when she heard a strange sound outside her door. It was late in the night, and Zara was extremely afraid. She decided to check what it was and was confronted by the sight of a frail old woman sitting under the tree close to her hut. "You called for me," the old woman said, as goosebumps filled Zara's entire body. "What worries you, precious one?" the old woman asked, and stammering out of fear, Zara told the old woman all that had been happening. The old woman listened intently as she spoke. She told Zara that people fear what they cannot understand, and that her dreadlocks were not a curse, but a gift to the entire village. Zara looked at the old woman in confusion as she asked what she meant by a gift. But before she could finish asking the question, the old woman disappeared into the night. Zara returned to her hut, unable to sleep, as she thought about all the old woman had said. She woke up the next morning to a loud noise in front of her hut and realized that a group of villagers had come to take her away. They all believed that Zara was cursed and had to be banished from their village. Zara's mother did all she could to stop them from taking her daughter away, but all her efforts proved futile, so she decided to leave the village with her daughter. Zara and her mother had nowhere to go, so they wandered from one village to the other. The people had never seen anyone with such hair before, and this terrified them, as they wondered if Zara's hair was made of snakes. No one let them settle in their village, so for days Zara and her mother slept in the dark forest as the mosquitoes feasted on their delicate bodies. However, despite the fear and rejection that they faced, Zara's mother never for once faltered in her belief that her daughter's hair was a blessing. She reminded Zara of her ancestry of warriors and healers who had carried the same dreadlocks through the ages, "Your hair is a symbol of strength," her mother said, "and one day it will show its true power to all." Zara clung to her mother's words, but couldn't take her mind off the possibility that the villagers might have been right. So, Zara, while her mother slept one night, snuck out of the forest away from her sleeping mother. It was not an easy decision for Zara, who could not stand the sight of her mother suffering for her sake. She hoped that her absence would force her mother to return to their village, back to her comfort, and she could not stand by and watch her suffer. Zara wandered from one village to the other, hoping to find someone who would accept her for who she was. She faced so many rejections on the way, as people called her a witch and a curse. But Zara did not give up as she kept on going. One night, as Zara lay to sleep in the forest, she saw a strange figure in the distance. It was the figure of a man who moved extremely fast. Zara was terrified as she wondered how a man could move so fast. Filled with terror, Zara tried to run away when the strange-looking man grabbed her by her hair. Zara noticed a bright glow that emanated from her dreadlocks. Zara watched as the strange-looking man transformed into a very handsome man. She was so amazed as she could not believe what had just happened. The young man thanked Zara for saving him and asked what she was doing alone in the forest. Zara explained all she had passed through in the hands of her people, who believed that she was cursed because of her hair. The young man urged Zara to follow him, as he could not watch her live in the forest. They walked into the village, and Zara was met with curious stares, not of fear but of wonder. The young man, who introduced himself as Daniel, was the prince of the village. He explained that an evil witch had cast a spell on him. turning him into a strange being doomed to roam the forest. Only the touch of one with a pure and misunderstood heart could break the curse. Zara, with her unique dreadlocks, was the one destined to break his curse. Daniel then led her to his father, the king, who was a wise and kind man. He listened to Zara's story,